Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar for the CMAP TAP and SCP Shared Fund call for projects. It looks like we've got about half of the registered attendees online already. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just as a reminder before I do start, a couple of housekeeping items. For those that don't know me, I'm Kama Dobbs, a Senior Program Analyst for CMAP and the manager of our SCP program. Doug Ferguson, the manager of the CMAC and TAP program, is unable to join us today, but I will do my best to cover those programs as well and answer questions there. Russell Petroviak, Mary Weber, and Elliot Lewis from CMAP are also here with me today to help moderate and answer your questions. Right now, everyone is currently muted, and because this is a webinar, there's no chat function for attendees. However, if you have a question or comment at any time during the webinar, please use the questions panel shown at the right of this slide with the red box around it to send your question to staff. Also, at the end of each section of the presentation, we'll give a minute or two for verbal questions. What I'll do is ask you to raise your hand using the button on the control panel that's circled in red here in this example. So let's go ahead and test that now. If you can hear me okay, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, great. I see hands popping up. Thank you, everybody. So the last thing that I wanted to note before diving into this is that we are recording this session, and that recording, as well as all of the presentation slides and a log of all of the comments and questions that you submit, will be posted on the Call for Projects webpage within the next couple of days. So today's session is the first of two Call for Projects webinars. Today is an overview of the funding programs and eligible projects. Next Friday, we'll dive deep into the application process. And both recordings will be available on that Call for Projects page. And that webpage is really most easily reached via the short URL there at the bottom, which is cmap.is/2021 call for projects. So diving into the funding programs and eligible projects, during the webinar today, I'll describe the funding programs, the project types that are eligible, basic requirements for all three programs, as well as the evaluation criteria and our schedule for the call for projects. So why are we here? As the MPO for Northeastern Illinois, CMAP is responsible for allocating certain federal funds directly to local transportation projects. CMAP solicits applications from local governments, highway and transit agencies, really for all phases of highway transit and bike ped maintenance, modernization, and expansion projects, and applies their scoring methodologies that have been developed by our project selection committees to recommend programs of projects for funding. The scoring methodologies and program development are largely driven by federal requirements, as well as the three principles of On to 2050, which are inclusive growth, resilience, and prioritized investment. We do program for 5 years at a time, 3 years for the TAP program, and can't program any more in any single year than is reasonably expected to be available in that year. Project applications are solicited through these calls for projects every 2 years, with the goal of each call to program the final 2 years and fill in projects in earlier years, only if funds have become available due to other projects being delayed or due to more updated estimates of available funds. The three funding programs in this call for projects are the Surface Transportation Program, or STP Shared Fund, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, known as CMAC, and then the locally programmed portion of the Transportation Alternatives Program, which I'll refer to as TAP or TAP-L. So first I'm going to talk about our newest program, the SCP Shared Fund. Approximately $22 million is available for us to program in each of the out years, that's 2025 and 2026. At this time, the earlier years are fully programmed, and we really don't anticipate adding any project phases into those years. The Shared Fund does target road reconstruction or expansion projects, transit stations, including bicycle and pedestrian access to those stations, bus speed improvements, corridor and small area safety projects, improvements to truck routes, highway rail grade crossing improvements, and new this cycle, projects that eliminate barriers to bicycle and pedestrian movement. Shared fund projects are evaluated on their readiness, transportation impact, planning factors, as well as sub-regional priority. To be eligible for the shared fund, projects must have a total cost for all phases, starting with preliminary engineering all the way through construction, of at least $5 million. Lower cost projects are eligible if they are regional in nature by being a partnership between 3 or more agencies, including at least 1 municipality. Partnership in this case means that all partners are participating financially in the project, not just providing letters of support. Preliminary, or what's known as phase 1 engineering, must be substantially complete prior to applying for funding, and projects must be included in an adopted local or regional plan, such as a municipal comprehensive plan or sub-regional bicycle pedestrian plan, a local or regional freight or truck routing plan, for example. The application booklet does provide guidance and a pretty comprehensive list of examples of acceptable local plans, as well as contact information for 2 of our CMAP planning staff that can answer project and plan specific questions. So what about existing projects? If your project is currently one of the 17 Shared Fund active program projects, a schedule change request form can be submitted for any phase programmed in 2022 or later, but a new application does not need to be submitted. For cost changes on those existing projects, sponsors should submit a new application, treating the currently programmed funds as committed and requesting any additional funds that are needed. If not selected for additional funding, nothing about the project's current status would change. If a project is selected for additional funding for an already programmed phase, the program funds may be moved to a different year in order to meet our fiscal constraint requirements for the entire program. I also want to note that projects currently in the contingency list or phases programmed in the current year that are at risk of not meeting an obligation deadline can reapply or should reapply as if they were a new project. And then for projects that are funded in other programs, such as a local council program or CMAC or HSIP, you can submit a new application to fill any funding gaps that exist in those projects. However, I just wanted to note that shared fund applications really should not be submitted to replace other committed funds. So the shared fund's intention, or one of the intentions, is to fill gaps in funding, not to replace other committed funds. So our next program, CMAC, has been around for many years. I think most folks know that CMAC funds come to Northeastern Illinois because we don't meet federal air quality standards for ozone. Therefore, the program is focused on reducing ozone precursor emissions from transportation mobile sources. The program in Northeastern Illinois receives approximately $110 million per year. Projects that are eligible for CMAC funding include transit service and capital improvement projects, projects like intersection improvements, signal interconnects, and bottleneck eliminations that improve traffic flow, bicycle facility projects that can lead to shifting people out of their cars, projects that directly reduce emissions through measures such as retrofitting existing diesel engines, repowering vehicles with cleaner engines, or replacing vehicles with alternative fuel vehicles. And then finally, other projects may be considered that result in emissions reductions. There are also a few project types that are not eligible for CMAC funding, including projects that add any single occupancy vehicle through lanes, operating expenses for existing transit services, and projects that are considered routine maintenance, such as retiming of existing signals, reconstruction of roads or bridges or transit stations, or in-kind replacement of transit track or other equipment. The third fund source available during this call for projects is TAP. The TAP program is focused on implementing ONTO 2050's recommendation to complete the Regional Greenways and Trails Plan by programming approximately $10 million per year for bicycle facilities. So there are several requirements for each of these programs that are common to all three. So I'm going to go over those now. Generally speaking, the project sponsor is the agency that will enter into financial agreements with IDOT or will be the FTA grant recipient, and therefore must be a unit of government that can levy taxes. This can include state agencies, municipalities, counties, townships, park and forest preserve districts, as well as transit agencies. Within the SCP Shared Fund only, non-municipal sponsors are strongly encouraged to partner with a municipality that's directly impacted by the proposed project. And within the TAP program only, IDOT is not an eligible sponsor, but is welcome to partner with other eligible sponsors. Private entities as well as nonprofits can't sponsor projects directly, but are definitely encouraged to partner with eligible sponsors. When partnering with others on a project, one eligible sponsor will take the lead, and there should be intergovernmental agreements between each partner and the sponsor for financial participation. Across all of the programs, phase 1 or preliminary engineering is not eligible for funding, except in the case of the region's highest need communities that are identified as cohort 4 in CMAP's fiscal year 20 community cohorts document. These communities are also listed in our program application booklet, and a link to the full community cohorts document is provided on the Call for Projects website. In addition to being ineligible for funding, preliminary engineering needs to be substantially complete prior to the March 5th application deadline. While it's desirable to have full design approval, preliminary engineering is considered to be substantially complete if IDOT verifies that all work leading up to the submittal of a phase 1 project development report is complete to a point that an accurate cost estimate and clear scope for the remaining phases of the project has been established. For transit projects that will be processed through an FTA grant, the sponsor needs to demonstrate that sufficient pre-engineering or architectural work has been completed to satisfy FTA's checklist for readiness to enter engineering, and like other projects, to establish an accurate cost estimate and a clear project scope. Because signal interconnect projects eligible for CMAC funding do not typically require a traditional phase 1 engineering process, these projects are ineligible for phase 2 engineering funding. In order to receive any of these federal funds, the sponsor needs to provide a minimum of 20% of the cost of each individual phase from a non-federal source. Each phase must be matched individually, so providing 100% local funding for phase 1 engineering, for example, does not reduce the match requirements for later phases. Examples of non-federal fund sources include motor fuel tax, Rebuild Illinois bond funds, state funds, or even local or regional programs like Invest and Cook or private funds. While federal rules permit the use of soft match in these programs, such as right-of-way donations, this really isn't recommended due to the additional administrative burden it places on project sponsors. Speaking of burdens, understanding the burden that providing match can place on the region's highest need communities, the use of transportation development credits, known commonly as toll credits, is permitted in lieu of local match if requested at the time of application for those highest need cohort 4 communities. While talking about funding requirements, I also want to remind everyone that these are reimbursement programs, so no funding is provided to project sponsors up front. For engineering phases and for construction phases that are let locally, the project sponsor needs to pay all costs first and then seek reimbursement from Federal Highway through IDOT or from the Federal Transit Administration or FTA. For construction projects that are let by IDOT, IDOT makes the payments to the construction contractor and then bills the sponsor for their share. So before I move on to talk about evaluation criteria for the specific programs, are there any questions about the basic eligibility requirements? I think let's start with the questions box, and then if you have another question that isn't answered, we'll use that raise your hand function to take those questions. Also, if there are questions that are specific to one of the fund sources, we'll skip over those for now, and if they aren't answered later in the presentation, we'll take them after those appropriate sections. So Elliot or Mary, could you read any questions from the questions box that pertain to basic eligibility?
We haven't received any.
Okay.
Oh, just got one. Michael Dumas. What years of funding are open at this time?
Thanks, Michael. There are the funding years for the CMAC and SCP Shared Fund are federal fiscal years 2022 to 2026. And as I mentioned earlier, we typically program in the last 2 years of that because we already have projects lined up in the first 3 years. For the TAP program, the years available are 2022 to 2024.
Next question is local match of 20% each phase is required for all 3 programs?
That is correct. All federal, well, these 3 federal fund sources require that minimum of 20%.
And then which site will this recording be posted to?
This recording will be posted on the Call for Projects page, which is cmap.is/2021 call for projects. And that web URL will show up several times in the presentation.
Next, if we are a cohort 4, can we include phase 1 in our funding request?
Absolutely. Cohort 4 communities are the only communities that can request funding for phase 1. I do want to point out, though, that if you do request funding for phase 1, all the subsequent phases cannot be applied for until after that phase 1 is completed.
Looks like we haven't received any more.
And I see no raised hand.
Oh, I was say we just got one more in and 2 more. For CMAC, what years did you say are eligible for funding?
2022 to 2026.
Let's see. If there is an STPL funded project in 2022 that has a funding shortfall, is it worth submitting an application for the shared fund, understanding that there may not be funds available?
Yeah, I think it is worth submitting the application. So I mentioned that current active program projects could submit schedule change requests. So as of the last quarterly status updates, it looks like everyone's on track for how they're scheduled, but if anyone does request a schedule change to a currently programmed project that would move it from 2022 to 2025, then there would be funds, could potentially be funds available in FY22 to program. So it definitely doesn't hurt to submit an application for that funding.
Are studies or the development of a municipal bicycle and pedestrian plans eligible for TAP-L?
They are not. So I would recommend, honestly, seeking funding for those type of studies through CMAP's local technical assistance program. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on because I don't see any raised hands. And if you've got a question that staff's not able to answer by responding in the questions box, we'll circle back and answer it again at the end. All right, so digging in now to how projects are evaluated. I'm going to start again with the shared fund just to keep us in the same order. The overall scoring matrix for the shared fund looks like this. A little scary, but it really isn't. The four main categories that I mentioned earlier, project readiness, transportation impact, planning factors, and sub-regional priority, are in the shaded rows with the criteria that make up those categories shown below and indented. All projects can receive up to 100 total points, with the highest scoring projects being given first consideration for available funding. Project readiness is worth 15% of the total score and includes up to 10 points for completing phase 2 design engineering milestones and right-of-way acquisition, and up to 5 points for leveraging other available fund sources like local STP, CMAC, Invest and Cook, or any other funds that would reduce the STP share of the project cost. Excuse me. Transportation impact scoring, which is 50% of the total score, varies by project type and is divided into 3 subcategories. In general, the existing condition scores are scaled within each project type based on the current condition that is germane to that project type. Improvement scores compare a project's potential to improve conditions relative to the total cost of the improvements. And then finally, the number of jobs and households that can potentially benefit from the project is determined by using the regional travel model to generate the travel shed of the places that people come from and go to using the facility being improved. All of the jobs and households within a project's travel shed are added together and scaled to 10 points relative to all other projects. So this table summarizes the factors considered for each project type to define existing conditions and to determine the relative need for the project. As you can see, the factors are generally tied to performance measures like condition, mobility, reliability, and safety. Likewise, the improvements considered for each project type are shown here. With each project type, the cost effectiveness of the improvements are scaled relative to each other. Detailed definitions and scoring breakdowns for both the need and improvement are included in the Shared Fund application booklet. Planning factors, which make up 30% of the total score, evaluate the extent to which the project or sponsor supports a number of regional planning priorities, including inclusive growth, complete streets, green infrastructure, multimodal freight movement, and transit supportive densities. These factors and the maximum points for each, again, vary by project type, but each project type can receive up to a maximum of 30 points from planning factors. Excuse me. So the inclusive growth planning factor awards points to projects based on the percentage of users of the facility that are people of color below the poverty line. These points are predetermined based on the map shown here. The complete streets and green infrastructure planning factors award points if the jurisdiction where the project is located has policies supporting complete streets or green infrastructure. Points are also awarded for inclusion of these elements in the scope of the project. Points for the freight planning factor are awarded to projects located on the National Highway Freight Network, on a designated Class 1 or Class 2 truck route, or a National Highway System intermodal freight connector. Additional points are awarded if a sponsor or local jurisdiction has freight supportive policies, if a sponsor completed freight related studies such as truck routing or truck restriction studies, or if the project is included in a freight mobility plan. Finally, the transit planning factor awards points for projects located in areas where higher densities are allowed, where innovative parking requirements exist, or where mixed-use zoning exists. While the bulk of the scoring methodology that I've talked about so far addresses our regional priorities, because our region is so large and diverse, it's also important to recognize that the 12 subregions defined by each Council of Mayors area and the City of Chicago also have unique priorities. As such, each council and the city have an opportunity to identify their 5 highest priority projects from all eligible applications submitted for the Shared Fund. Those priorities are worth up to 10% of the total score and will receive the points shown here. Although it's anticipated that councils and CDOT would identify projects located within their borders as their highest priorities, they may also identify priorities outside of their borders by providing a clear justification of the transportation benefit to their residents and or to persons working or traveling within their subregion. Projects that are designated as priorities by more than one subregion will receive the combined points up to a maximum of 5. So before I talk about CMAC and TAP, are there questions about the SCP Shared Fund evaluation process? And I'd say let's again start with the questions box. And if you have another question about the Shared Fund evaluation that isn't answered, go ahead and raise your hand. So Elliot, do you want to ask questions from the box?
We had a question earlier about eligibility, about signal interconnects and ineligibility phase 2 engineering. George says his experience is phase 1 CE processing is required based on several past projects that he's done. So why is the signal interconnects eligible for phase 2?
That's a question that I think Doug probably needs to answer afterwards. So, George, we will have Doug circle back with you personally, and then when we post the question and answer log for this webinar, we'll make sure that that answer is in there.
Another question is, what constitutes adoption of a policy such as green infrastructure? Documentation required within the application itself?
So adoption of a policy means that your local board has approved that policy that preferably was developed with public input. So what you'll need to provide is just a link to that posted policy or a PDF copy of the policy attached to the application.
And then after projects are awarded, are applicants able to see their scores?
So scores will be released late May or early June is the target. So applicants will be sent their total score and actually a list of everybody's total scores and have a chance to throw up a red flag if it looks like a project scored significantly higher or lower than expected. But I think one thing to keep in mind about scoring with the shared fund is particularly for the need and improvement score, scores are relative to the other applications received in this cycle. So even if you applied for the same project in the last call for projects, the total number of points is likely to be different.
And then we do have one hand raised. Dustin, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, hi. I work for a transit agency, and we're looking at the TAPL fund for a potential upgrade to our transit vehicles for bicycle facilities. So I was wondering if this would just be categorically ineligible, or if there's a potential that such an upgrade could be eligible.
So probably would be best to talk in detail about the project specifically to Doug when he's back in the office. And it's probably more likely that the project would be eligible for CMAC funding. TAP funding is focused on actual bicycle facilities. So improvements to those are new facilities. But both the shared fund and CMAC do allow for projects that provide bicycle and pedestrian connections to transit.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other hands?
No, there are no other hands up.
Great, thanks, Mary. All right, so moving on to the CMAC evaluation. The CMAC program has 3 screening criteria. The transportation projects must have demonstrated or must have a demonstrated air quality benefit as estimated by CMAP staff. All bicycle facility projects must be found in an adopted or approved plan, and the projects must have realistic development schedules. Projects that don't meet these screening criteria will not be funded. Projects are scored on a 100-point scale, with the majority of the points coming from air quality cost effectiveness. 30 points are available from transportation impact criteria specific to the project type, and 10 points are available from inclusive growth scoring. The air quality cost effectiveness is calculated by using the estimated emissions reduction and the total project cost. All project types except the direct emissions reduction projects are based on the volatile organic compound, or VOC, emissions reduction. Those direct emissions reduction projects are evaluated on a combination of particulate matter and nitrous oxides emissions. For the project costs, all costs associated with all phases of the project should be provided, even those phases that are already completed, or if funding was received outside of the CMAP program, with one exception. For bicycle side path projects only that are being completed as part of a larger road project, only the costs associated with the bicycle facility are considered because the side path has independent utility from the road improvements. Finally, cost effectiveness is reported as dollars per kilogram of VOC eliminated, or dollars per kilogram of PM and NOx that are eliminated. The transportation impact criteria scoring is different based on the project type as summarized here, and I'll go over each of those individually on the next few slides. For highway projects, travel time reliability is worth 15 points and is measured based upon the planning time index for the project roadway and the qualitative characteristics of the proposed improvement, such as inclusion of certain ITS solutions or elements that improve incident detection, response, and recovery. And those are listed along with their point values in the application booklet. The safety score is calculated using IDOT Safety Road Index, or SRI, for roadway segments and intersections. Lastly, if the project is part of a corridor improvement, and if the project design and scope includes a transit improvement like transit signal priority, queue jumping, dedicated bus lanes, corridor and transit improvement points will be awarded. For transit projects, ridership increase is the overall increase in transit ridership resulting from the project and is worth 10 points. Travel time reliability, used for transit service projects only, is composed of a quantitative measure of on-time performance on a particular route with a qualitative evaluation of the project's impact on reliability, which is described in detail in the application booklet. Existing asset condition is used only for transit capital projects and is based on the condition of the asset being improved using the scores from the RTA asset inventory. Finally, points are awarded for transit supportive land use based on the permitted density, the use of innovative parking requirements, and the presence of mixed-use zoning around the project. So very similar to the shared fund. Bicycle projects are scored on 3 factors. Safety and attractiveness compares the condition after the improvement to the before condition. So the larger the difference in the condition is, the higher the score. The connectivity measure considers the connection to other bikeways or level of traffic stress for connecting roadways. And both of those scores are calculated and the highest of the two is retained. Finally, because measuring transit availability helps ensure that a bicycle facility provides a realistic alternative to auto use by evaluating the potential to linking bicycling with transit for longer trips, projects receive higher points for higher transit availability, which is also an ONTO 2050 indicator. Direct emissions reduction projects receive 5 points if they are improving public fleets. And then the benefit to sensitive populations is scored based on an index that looks at particulate concentrations in relationship to populations within census tracts that are either over the age of 65, under the age of 5, or minority or low income. And those scores are actually calculated ahead of time as well, and details are included in the CMAC application booklet. The last element of CMAC scoring is inclusive growth, which is the same in the CMAC program as the SCP Shared Fund program, where points are awarded to projects based on the percentage of users of the facility that are people of color below the poverty line. And these points, same as Shared Fund, are predetermined based on the map shown here. Our last funding program is the TAP program. To receive TAP funding, the project needs to be a bicycle facility project that's included in an adopted or approved plan and has a realistic development schedule. Projects are scored on a 100-point scale, with 30 points coming from how the project helps complete the Regional Greenways and Trails Plan, 25 points from the population and employment density of the area around the facility, and 25 points from the safety and attractiveness rating, which, like CMAC bicycle projects, compares the after condition to the before condition. 10 more points are awarded for the inclusive growth planning factor using the same methods as STP and CMAC, and the final 10 points are from project readiness, with points awarded if right-of-way has already been acquired or is not needed, and if phase 2 engineering is already complete. So before I wrap up with the application process and timeline, are there any questions regarding CMAC and TAP-L project evaluations? I do just want to say, as I noted earlier, I am pinch hitting for Doug Ferguson today, so I'm going to do my best to answer, but there may be some follow-up after the webinar required. So let's again start with the questions box, and then we'll move on to raised hands.
We have a few questions. One, does a bike project included in a capital improvement plan count towards being part of an approved plan?
Yes.
Yes. Does a CMAC project have to have a connection to transit?
They do not have to have a connection to transit. Based on the scoring criteria, some projects will receive more points for connections to transit.
Okay, these are coming in fast. The CMAC application workbook has several inputs related to ridership. So do these inputs call for a current or horizon year estimate? And would we report total trips on the project or only new transit trips?
I think Doug's going to need to answer that question in more detail. Those details should be in the application booklet, and we are going to talk about that some in the next webinar next Friday. And it looks like Russell probably wants to jump in with an answer as well.
Yeah, one thing to keep in mind is that the application booklet's not been released yet. So
Right.
Once it's released, there'll be more details. And I would save that question until the new application book is released. So if the new application book doesn't answer that question, then you can email one of the contacts that'll be listed in the application book.
Thank you, Russell.
So over what area is air quality measured? So Russell, since you're on.
Russell, you want to take that one?
Which question? There's a lot of questions that have come in. Which one was that one again,
So
Elliot?
that was over what area is air quality measured?
Over what area? So we measure, it depends on the project. So different project types have different evaluation criteria, such as, if you get diesel locomotives, it's the engines. If you have intersection improvements, it's where the project is located. The application booklet will actually detail what is required in terms of inputs so that we can do the evaluation. But they are, it is on a project level.
So I've got the questions box visible now, so I'm going to just pick off a couple here. So questions about the application booklet or application workbook questions, those will be answered at next Friday's webinar, where we'll dig into the application process in both ETIP and the workbook. Completion of phase 2 is defined as having your plan specs and estimates done. CMAC and TAP do not require a minimum of 5 million construction costs, so that requirement only applies to the SCP Shared Fund. Several people are asking about multiple applications for different projects. Yes, a sponsor can apply for multiple projects. However, I would just recommend that you keep in mind that if you're awarded all of those projects, you need to have the financial means to cover all those projects, because this is a reimbursement program, as I mentioned earlier. To Dave Tomzik's question, yes, there is a demonstration project category within the CMAC program. And Dustin, yes, TAP can be used for phase 2 engineering for those bicycle facility projects. Application booklet, as well as FAQs, this recording, all of the forms that are necessary will be posted when the call for projects opens, which is this Friday, January 8th. So if there's another question that I haven't hit, or folks would like to ask a verbal question, I'll ask Mary to recognize those folks and that are raising their hands.
Kama, I see no raised hands at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to talk real slow for a second and give folks a chance. There's one.
Oh, okay.
maybe.
Oh, I don't see it anymore.
Okay. There will be time for additional questions at the end of the presentation as well. So I will go ahead and motor forward, and we'll open that up again. So digging into, just a reminder that we'll be digging into the application process in detail at next week's webinar. But I did want to give a quick overview and discuss the timeline and resources for the call for projects today. So applications get submitted through CMAP's online ETIP database. ETIP gathers the basic project description and requested funding information, provides a tool for mapping the project location, and provides a file uploader for attaching all documents related to the project application, including the application workbook, which is attached in ETIP. That asks in-depth technical questions specific to each fund source and project type, as well as a detailed cost estimate, a project schedule for CMAC and TAP, or a status update form for the shared fund, and other forms that are required by project type or other supplemental information that the applicant wants to provide to staff. Finally, just a reminder that all applicants except for transit agencies must be registered grantees as required by the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act through the state's grants.illinois.gov portal in order to apply for and receive these federal transportation funds. The general timeline for the call for projects is shown here. All applications are due by close of business on March 5th, with local projects having been saved as final by February 19th for planning liaison review. Planning liaisons will review those applications for completeness as well as potential errors before the final submittal to CMAP. So during that PL review time, which is pretty soft deadline, changes can still be made and attachments can be added prior to that final March 5th submittal deadline. From March through June, CMAP staff will complete project evaluation and scoring, and we will present staff recommended programs to the respective project selection committees on July 1st. That will kick off a public comment period on those staff recommended programs, and that public comment period will run through July 30th. Following the comment period, staff will review comments, make any necessary updates to the recommended programs, and will present final programs to the project selection committees, on September 9th. Once approved by the committees, tip changes will be made for transportation committee consideration, and final approval of the programs will occur when the CMAP board and NPO policy committee approve those tip changes at their joint meeting on October 13th. The best place to find the information you need to submit an application is that Call for Projects webpage, which is cmap.is/2021 Call for Projects. All of the application materials and forms, the recording, slides, and Q&A from today's and next week's webinars, as well as frequently asked questions can be found on this page. And all of those materials, as I mentioned earlier, will be posted by Friday morning when the Call for Projects opens. Local agencies can also reach out to your planning liaison if you have questions. Not only are the PLs experts on these programs, they also know more about your local projects, and of course will be reviewing your applications before submittal to CMAP. So now's that chance for additional questions that I haven't answered already. Anything additional in the questions panel, or verbal questions, or if I missed your written question, go ahead and raise your hand, and Mary will take care of unmuting you and making sure that question gets answered.
In the questions box, there's a couple of questions about cohort 4 communities. If a community is asking for phase 1 engineering, may they still ask for 100% construction funding?
So this cohort 4 communities seeking phase 1 engineering funding can only receive phase 1 engineering funding up to 100% as a result of this call for projects. Once that phase 1 engineering is completed, those communities can then request funds for subsequent phases, including phase 2, right-of-way construction and construction engineering in a subsequent call for projects. So.
And along with that, is there a separate earlier deadline for these communities applying for 100% funding?
No, there is not. All the deadlines are the same.
We do have one hand raised. Richard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, so I put a question in the question box earlier about oh wait, I'm sorry, I think that was one you got to. Because I put in a couple questions on cohort 4.
Yeah, those were your
Okay.
questions.
There are no other hands raised.
I see one question going back to the SCP Shared Fund. The commenter noted that in the past there were focus areas by year that the project selection committee wanted to focus or limit the application types. That strategy has been abandoned, so this call for projects is open to all of the eligible project types within the shared fund. Other questions? If we missed a written question and you'd still like to ask it, go ahead and stick a hand up. All right. If not, I am
We have
throwing
a
up.
couple of questions real
Oh,
quick.
go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so is the SCP Shared Fund application booklet posted on the website? It'll be posted on Friday, right? The new one?
Correct. Yep.
Yes. Mark asks, if a cohort community gets 100% phase 1 funding but decides not to continue after phase 1, do they have to fully reimburse?
So that would depend on federal requirements. So if you go through your phase 1 and come to a conclusion that you're selecting the no build alternative as the conclusion of your phase 1, then no, federal funds do not need to be paid back. If you select a preferred alternative with the intent to move forward and then don't move forward within the time period required by the Federal Highway Administration, then yes, you would have to pay back those funds.
And lastly, for a bike path submitted for CMAC, do you also need to submit for TAP? In the past, it would be automatically submitted as both.
So you're correct. In the past, it was automatically evaluated as both. In this call for projects, that evaluation will not be automatic. There are fund source checkboxes in the ETIP application form, and if you want to be considered for both fund sources, you'll just need to check those 2 boxes.
And then we do have one hand raised. Richard, I'm going to unmute you. I'm not sure if you had a follow-up question.
Yeah, I had a follow-up to my earlier question about the about how emissions reduction is scored. I was just wondering for a transportation project, if it reduces emissions on net over the whole region for traffic alternatives, is that good for that category, or does it have to be cleaning the air quality in that particular corridor?
Richard, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question today. If you don't mind, I'm going to put you in touch with Doug Ferguson when he's back, and he can explain to you in detail how the emissions reduction is calculated. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll make that connection. Thank you.
Okay, there are no other hands raised.
And no other questions in the question box.
All right, well, with that, I'm going to throw in a final reminder to join us next Friday for the second part of the webinar, which is how to submit an application via the ETIP database. We'll also go over the application workbook on that webinar. And as I've mentioned several times, the Call for Projects website is shown here, as well as my email address for STP Shared Fund questions in particular, as well as Doug's email address for CMAC and TAP questions. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and I will hang out for just a minute to make sure you weren't furiously trying to type into the questions box. Sherry, to answer your question, hard copies are not required. Everything is submitted via the ETIP database. Yes, the PowerPoint slides will be available before Friday morning. All right. Everybody have a great day. Thank you very much. And we'll get these questions and answers and slides and stuff posted as soon as we can, but no later than Friday morning. Thank you, everyone.